When the widow came home, the town didn't greet her with kindness. Only whispers, cold stares, and she thought her loneliness was the deepest wound. Until she touched the scar of a man the wind carried dust like old whispers across the plains, lifting skirts of brittle grass and rattling the bare branches of cottonwoods. Evelyn Carter pressed forward through it, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her boots sinking into the cold dirt of the wagon trail. She had walked all morning, and still her breath misted white in the air, rising then breaking apart like fragile prayers. The shape of the settlement appeared against the horizon, not welcoming, but stern, as though the town itself disapproved of her return. A scatter of buildings hunched low against the wind, their roofs patched with tin and their chimneys sighing thin trails of smoke. Closer still, beyond the mill and the mercantile, she saw the outline of her husband's cabin. It stood apart from the others, weather-beaten and leaning, its fences broken, its roof patched poorly by hands that had not known how to mend. Her pace slowed when she saw it. The rocking chair still sat on the porch, swaying as though stirred by memory rather than wind. The axe leaned against the chopping block, blade rusted with neglect. The fields beyond, once her husband's pride, were wild with thistles. A place, haunted not by spirits but by the weight of abandonment. His absence pressed on the land itself. She reached the cabin steps and paused. A widow's silence followed her like a shadow. She had been gone too long, hiding with kin who had no room for her grief, and now she returned to this broken remnant because there was nowhere else left to go. With one hand she touched the post of the porch, the wood rough beneath her fingers, scarred by years of storms. A murmur drifted from the road behind her. She turned, and there they were, townsfolk, their glances half curious, half condemning. A ranch wife tugged her child close, whispering. Two men leaned against the hitch rail outside the smithy, their voices low but sharp enough to reach her ear. "Carter's woman back again," one muttered. "She married a dreamer," said the other. "Dreamers don't last long out here." She lowered her gaze and entered the cabin. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cold stone. A bird's nest had fallen into the hearth. Mice had chewed at the burlap sacks once filled with grain. She set her small bundle down on the table and began brushing away the cobwebs with the hem of her shawl. That afternoon she forced herself into town, for she needed flour, salt, and lamp oil. The mercantile door creaked as she entered, the bell jangling overhead with a note too bright for the hush that followed. Mr. Dobson, the storekeeper, looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Well," he said, the words slow, uncertain. "Evelyn Carter." She placed her coins on the counter, her fingers stiff with the cold. Flour, salt, oil. Dobson measured each out, the clink of the scoop in the barrel echoing in the silence. When she slid the coins toward him, he took them without word, but his wife, perched on a stool near the stove, muttered just loud enough. "Bad luck, some women bring it with them. Men too young around 'em, that's the truth of it." Evelyn's face burned, but she said nothing. She gathered her parcels and left, the weight of eyes trailing her as though she carried something contagious. Outside, a wagon rattled past, its wheels striking hard against the frozen ruts, and she felt suddenly small. A ghost returned to a town that did not want her. Only one man had acknowledged her without scorn. On her way back, the preacher, old Reverend Hale, had lifted a hand in solemn recognition. His beard was white, his eyes weary but kind. He did not speak, but the gesture, slight as it was, felt like a single candle lit in a cavern of darkness. That night Evelyn sat by the fire she had coaxed to life from damp wood. The flames were weak, but the warmth eased into her fingers, cracked and raw from the day's work of sweeping, patching, and kindling. The cabin, though humble, now bore the faintest breath of life again. She unpinned her hair, long and dark with streaks of silver, and began to braid it with slow, deliberate motions. It was a ritual more than a necessity, something that tethered her to herself when all else had unraveled. Each twist of hair between her fingers was a reminder of continuity, of endurance. The silence pressed thick around her, heavier than grief, heavier than sleep. Beyond the walls, coyotes cried on the distant ridge, and the wind rattled the shutters like an impatient hand. She looked into the firelight, the shadows painting her face with a kind of weary grace. She remembered her husband's laughter, how it had once filled these walls. She remembered the way he had spoken of this land as though it would save them both, only for it to betray him, or perhaps for him to betray himself with dreams too large to survive. Now she sat alone, abandoned by time and by the judgment of others, visible in her widowhood, invisible in her worth. Yet somewhere deep within that silence stirred a question. Would survival mean hardening her heart into stone, or daring, one day, to let another soul near it again? She did not yet know the answer, but she knew this. She had come back not to vanish, but to endure. The fire cracked softly and the braid slipped loose in her lap. Evelyn Carter closed her eyes, leaning into the quiet that was no longer grief alone, but the beginning of something else, a reckoning with the life that still stretched before her, long and uncertain, as wide as the plains themselves. The day shortened swiftly, as though the sun itself no longer wished to linger over the prairie. Frost crept down the cabin windows each morning, feathering the glass with white lace that vanished only when Evelyn set her fire roaring. Winter pressed its hand upon the land, and with it came the relentless solitude of survival. Evelyn rose before dawn most days. She split wood until her palms stung and the calluses tore. She climbed to the roof, hammer in hand, to patch the leaks that had let in the storm water. She scraped at the earth of her meager garden, though the soil yielded little beyond stubborn roots and shriveled carrots. In every task the silence loomed, a silence she filled with breath and effort, never conversation. And yet the cabin was never empty. Its corners whispered of the man who had once filled it with sound. His rifle leaned still in the corner, dust on the barrel, the cleaning rag he had promised to use lying stiff with old oil. In a chest at the foot of her narrow bed lay her wedding dress, folded with care, yellowing with years. Sometimes she lifted the lid only to close it again, for the sight of white cloth seemed more ghost than garment. On a shelf near the hearth sat his broken watch, the glass cracked, the hands forever stopped at a meaningless hour. These objects seemed more alive than she felt, as though they pulsed with memory while she trudged through her days half asleep. At night, she sat in the rocking chair, shawl around her shoulders, listening to the creak of wood beneath her weight. The sound reminded her that time still moved, even if the watch on the shelf had not. She braided her hair by firelight, her fingers moving from memory, the long strands slipping like water through her hands. It was the one act that connected her to herself, to the woman she had been before widowhood carved hollows in her face. The cabin was not the only place where the past lingered. The land itself carried scars. Old wagon ruts ran across the plains, half swallowed by grass but still visible when the light was right. Crosses marked shallow graves along the trail outside town, men lost to fever, hunger, or violence. Evelyn felt their presence as she walked to fetch water from the stream, the air thick with memory and mourning. It was on one such errand, bucket in hand, that she heard the thunder of hooves. She crouched behind a willow by the bank, peering across the ridge. A column of soldiers rode by, their blue coats bright even beneath the gray sky. Between them walked a line of prisoners, hands bound, shoulders bent beneath the weight of snow and mud. They were natives, their faces weathered by wind and hardship, their steps driven forward by the soldiers' rifles. One man stumbled. He was young, though scars already marked his cheek and temple. His hair, long and dark, had come loose from its binding, falling into his eyes. As he fell to one knee, the soldier behind him jerked him forward with the butt of a rifle. For a heartbeat his gaze lifted, and met Evelyn's. It was no more than an instant, yet it seared her. His eyes held both defiance and sorrow, twisted together like rope pulled too tight. They did not plead, nor did they curse. They simply revealed a depth of endurance that unsettled her to her marrow. She gripped the bucket until her knuckles whitened, and when the soldiers and their captives passed beyond the ridge, she found her breath had fled her chest. That night, rain began to fall. It drummed against the patched roof, steady and unrelenting. a sound that kept her from sleep. In the restless hours before dawn, she dreamed, though it felt more vision than dream. She saw firelight flashing on steel. She saw brands pressed into flesh, the hiss and scream mingling in the air. She saw men laughing as another man's dignity was stripped with a single cruel act of burning. When she woke, her shawl was damp with tears she had not known she shed. The fire had gone out, leaving only cold ash in the hearth. She sat upright, clutching the braid she had woven before sleep, now tangled from her tossing. The memory of the prisoner's eyes returned to her with unbearable clarity. In them, she had seen the same thing that haunted her own reflection. The mark of loss, the wound of being cast aside, the ache of dignity stolen. The storm passed, leaving the world washed and raw. Outside, the prairie shone under a thin mist, every blade of grass beaded with rain. Evelyn stood on the porch, shawl pulled close, listening to the quiet after the deluge. Her rocking chair swayed faintly in the damp wind, as though moved by unseen hands. The past would not release her, not her husband's sudden death, not the judgment of the townsfolk, not the emptiness of her bed. But now, another shadow had entered her solitude, the scarred face of the man on the ridge, his eyes speaking of a suffering that echoed her own. She could not shake it. She sensed then that grief was not hers alone. The land carried it. The people carried it, settler and native alike. War had carved wounds deep into the soil and into the bodies of those who walked upon it. Some carried brands of iron, others carried the quieter brands of memory and shame. Her survival, she realized, might depend not merely on enduring her solitude, but on facing these shared shadows. She had hidden from them for years, nursing her grief like a wound. Yet the country itself, scarred and restless, seemed to whisper that hiding would no longer be enough. The bucket at her feet was still half full from the stream, rainwater mingling with the river's current. She lifted it with both hands, the cold seeping into her palms, and carried it inside. Behind her the clouds broke, and a pale band of light touched the plains, stark and unyielding. Evelyn Carter stepped into her cabin, the weight of the water heavy, the weight of the shadows heavier still. The wind rose first, keening like a widow's cry across the barren land. By nightfall the snow had begun, a white curtain drifting heavy and relentless, swallowing the world inch by inch. Evelyn Carter stacked wood high beside the hearth, her shawl wrapped tight as she stirred the fire. Already the windows had turned to pale squares of shifting gray, the glass rattling with each gust. She knew this storm would not be brief. The air carried that certain stillness beneath the howl, the kind that warned of days trapped inside, days where survival meant tending the fire without pause. She braided her hair quickly, fingers stiff with cold, then sat in the rocking chair to wait out the night. It was near midnight when the sound came. At first she thought it was the storm itself, a branch striking against the wall perhaps. Then it came again, knocking, faint and desperate, barely rising above the roar of the blizzard. Evelyn froze, her breath caught in her chest. No traveler should be out in such weather. No friend would come. Again, the knock, weak, faltering. Her hand shook as she lifted the rifle from beside the hearth. She crept to the door, the wind pushing against it like an impatient hand. When she opened it a crack, snow swirled inward, blinding her. And then, a shape, collapsing. Fortune. A man, half frozen, fell across the threshold with a muffled groan. He was the scarred one, the young man she had glimpsed among the line of prisoners. His dark hair was matted with snow, his lips blue, his body trembling with exhaustion. The coarse fabric of his coat had been torn away at the chest, exposing the brand seared into his flesh. A cruel mark carved there by soldiers read and raised a wound that had healed only on the surface. For a moment Evelyn could only stare, torn between fear and pity. She should send him back into the night. The soldiers would punish her for harboring him should they find out. Yet as he shuddered on her floor, breath shallow, she saw not an enemy, but a man near death. She set down the rifle. With trembling, Hands, she dragged him toward the hearth. His body was heavy, limp with exhaustion, but she pulled him close enough that the firelight touched his skin. Snow melted into puddles beneath him, soaking the floorboards. He tried to speak. His voice, rough, the words broken in English. "No, soldiers, run." Then his head fell back, eyes closing. Evelyn fetched blankets from her bed and wrapped them around him. She heated water, dipping a cloth to clean the blood at his temple. Each time her hand brushed the brand at his chest, he flinched violently, even in his half-conscious state. She whispered without thinking, "Hush now, hush," though her voice was as unsteady as her hands. When at last he lay still, she sat near the fire, watching him. He looked younger in the quiet, though the scars said otherwise. His cheekbone bore a long-healed cut. His wrists, raw from binding, told of recent captivity. He was no longer the defiant figure on the ridge, but a man stripped bare by suffering. The storm raged on, snow battering the roof and piling against the door. For 3 days it did not cease. Evelyn tended him through the hours, spooning broth between his lips, drying his clothes by the fire, pressing cool cloths to his fevered skin. Slowly, color returned to his face, and with it, his words. "Thomas," he said at last, his voice hushed, the name spoken carefully. Then, after a pause, he added, "My people. Call me another, older." She nodded, though she did not ask. A name was enough. Their silence became its own language. She offered him food. He fixed the broken hinge on her door with practiced hands. She fetched water. He chopped wood with what strength he had regained. Each act, small in itself, wove them closer. At night, when she sat to braid her hair, she felt his eyes on her. Not bold, not unkind, but watchful, as if the ritual itself carried meaning he did not wish to disturb. She wondered what he saw, a widow clinging to habit, or a woman reminding herself she still existed. She did not ask, for fear of breaking the fragile peace between them. She, in turn, noticed the way his hands trembled whenever they brushed against the brand on his chest. He hid it beneath the shirt she had mended, but when he thought her gaze elsewhere, his fingers traced it with quiet rage, as though trying to erase what fire had carved. Outside, the storm roared like judgment, the snow rising against the walls until the cabin seemed a ship lost at sea. Inside, there was only the crackle of fire and the shared breath of 2 souls stranded together. Evelyn knew the danger she had invited into her home. Soldiers would not forgive this. The townsfolk would condemn her further. Yet loneliness, she realized, felt more dangerous still. The man by her hearth was marked by cruelty, yes, but also by endurance. His presence filled the silence, not with noise, but with something steadier, a quiet reminder that she was not the only one the world had cast aside. On the 3rd evening, when the storm at last began to wane, Thomas sat near the fire, mending one of her broken tools. His hands moved slowly, steadying after days of rest. Evelyn watched the glow touch his face, the scars softened by warmth. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. The blizzard had left drifts taller than fences, but within the cabin something else had taken root, fragile, unspoken, yet undeniable. When the storm finally broke, the world emerged sharp and white, every fence post and roof line burdened with snow. Evelyn Carter stepped outside to a silence so deep it pressed upon her ears. The wind had stilled, leaving only the brittle crack of ice breaking on branches and the soft groan of snow slipping from the cabin's eaves. But peace was an illusion. Danger had merely shifted its shape. By mid-morning, word reached the edge of the settlement. A prisoner had escaped during transfer. Soldiers rode house to house, asking questions in their clipped tones, their eyes sharp beneath the brims of their hats. Evelyn kept to her cabin, her shawl tight around her shoulders, her pulse heavy in her throat. Thomas hid in the loft, crouched low among stored sacks of grain and old tools. She could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing above her head. Every creak of the boards set her nerves on edge. for if the soldiers came here, the cabin would betray them both. 2 riders appeared at her gate that afternoon. Their horses pawed the snow while the men leaned from their saddles, rifles strapped across their backs. "Ma'am," one called, "seen any strangers pass this way?" Evelyn shook her head, hands tucked into her shawl. "Only the storm," she answered. The men lingered, eyes scanning her yard, the sagging fence, the smoking chimney. One muttered something to the other, a phrase she could not catch, but she heard the doubt in it. At last they tipped their hats and rode on, leaving the snow churned with hoofprints. Inside, Thomas descended from the loft, his steps noiseless as falling ash. His face was tense, but his eyes held a quiet gratitude. She busied herself with the fire, unwilling to meet his gaze for fear her own relief would show too plainly. The days that followed wove fear and tenderness into one thread. Thomas worked in the yard, repairing her broken fence with hands that moved deftly despite scars. He showed her how to read the snow for signs of wolves, the way paw prints curved toward the henhouse, the drag of a tail along the drifts. She listened carefully, for she had never learned to see the land as language. In return, she offered him small gifts of dignity. Coffee by the fire, poured into the one unchipped mug, a place at the table rather than in the shadows. She did not speak of gratitude nor of pity. She simply saw him, not as a fugitive, not as a danger, but as a man whose presence steadied the silence that once threatened to smother her. And yet, the air between them grew taut with unspoken truth. His people named hers destroyers. Her people named his savages. The history between them was a canyon neither could bridge with ease. Sometimes she caught him staring into the fire, jaw set, as though remembering voices long silenced. Sometimes he watched her braid her hair in the mornings, his gaze fixed not on her face but on the ritual itself, as if the act carried a strength he recognized. At night, the cabin seemed to hold not just their bodies, but their ghosts. Evelyn dreamed of her wedding dress, white fabric smeared with ash trailing through the snow as if it had burned in a fire she could not quench. She woke with the taste of smoke in her throat, the braid in her lap undone. Thomas, too, carried his shadows. Some nights he woke with a start, eyes wide, chest heaving, his hand pressed against the brand beneath his shirt. When she asked no questions, he seemed almost relieved. She did not need his words to know what he heard in his dreams. The hiss of fire, the laughter of soldiers, the smell of flesh marked against its will. One evening, as she poured him coffee, their hands brushed. A spark leapt, fragile yet undeniable. Neither spoke of it, but afterward their silences were no longer empty. Still, fear gnawed at her. Fear of discovery, fear of what the town would say, fear of what it meant to let her heart lean toward someone marked as enemy. Yet when she looked at him, the set of his shoulders as he worked, the patience in his gaze when she stumbled over words, she recognized something deeper. They were both branded, though by different fires. She bore the invisible mark of rejection, of widowhood, of whispers that declared her cursed. He bore the brand carved by iron, by war, by cruelty. Both carried wounds that had stripped them of place and dignity. Both longed not for pity, but for the chance to be seen whole. On the coldest morning yet, Evelyn braided her hair beside the hearth, fingers stiff but steady. She sensed Thomas watching again, silent in the doorway. For once, she did not turn away. She let him see her, shawl slipping from her shoulders, the firelight touching the silver threads woven among the dark. He did not speak, but in his eyes she read respect, and something that trembled close to tenderness. The snow outside gleamed, harsh and unforgiving. Yet within the cabin, a fragile warmth had taken root. It was not trust spoken aloud, nor affection named, but something older, survival carried together side by side. They had no promise of safety. The soldiers still searched, the town still judged. But beneath the roof of that weather-beaten cabin, fear and tenderness coiled, together shaping a bond deeper than words could ever name. The soldiers came at dawn, Their shout split the silence of the frozen plain, their rifles glinting pale beneath a weak sun. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her braid brushing her shoulder, the rifle steady in her grip though her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Beside her, Thomas stepped forward, his scar exposed like a banner of defiance, his jaw set with a calm fierceness that spoke of a man who had already faced death and chosen to meet it again if need be. The first shot never came. Instead, it was Thomas who moved, fast and deliberate, his voice deep and commanding as he leveled the rifle. "You'll not cross this threshold," he said. "Not today." The soldiers hesitated. Perhaps it was the fire in his stance. Perhaps the sight of Evelyn beside him, not cowering, not pleading, but standing shoulder to shoulder with him, rifle raised. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, cold and brutal. One soldier pushed forward, his hand twitching near the trigger. Thomas fired, not to kill, but to warn. The bullet struck the snow at the man's feet, sending up a spray of white. Another soldier, braver or more foolish, rushed the fence. Thomas swung the butt of the rifle, dropping him hard against the rail. Evelyn's own shot cracked the air, splintering a post inches from the soldiers' horses. The animals reared, panicked, their riders shouting to regain control. The clash was fierce, but it lasted only minutes. When the smoke cleared, two soldiers lay in the snow groaning, their wounds shallow but painful. The others, rattled and disordered, dragged them back to their saddles. The leader, clutching a bloodied arm, met Thomas's eyes. His face was pale, his breath uneven. "Not all uniforms carry justice," he rasped. The words came like confession, torn from a man who had seen the hollow heart of his orders. Thomas lowered the rifle, his chest heaving. He did not strike again. He let the soldiers retreat, their curses fading into the distance, their hoofprints quickly swallowed by falling snow. Evelyn stepped close, her hand brushing his arm. They had defended the cabin, not with slaughter, but with the unyielding will to remain unbroken. When silence returned, it was heavier than before, yet different, no longer suffocating but sacred. Evelyn and Thomas stood together, the fire from within still warming their veins. The homestead bore scars of the fight, splintered rails, shattered glass, a bullet hole torn through the doorframe. Yet the cabin still stood, and within its walls burned a flame of survival that no storm could extinguish. Evelyn, once the abandoned widow, no longer kept her fire alone. She now shared it with a man the world had tried to brand as less than human. Winter ebbed slowly. The snow melted in hesitant streams, the ground softening beneath the first timid warmth of spring. Evelyn and Thomas mended the fences together, their hands working side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the low murmur of conversation. In the mornings she brewed coffee, the rich steam curling through the cabin, and they drank it by the pale light of dawn. In the evenings they sat in the rocking chairs on the porch, the rhythm steady, the silence full rather than hollow. The scars remained, his upon his skin, hers upon her heart, but in their presence they lost their sting. When the thaw came in earnest, Thomas pressed seeds into the damp earth of the garden plot. He showed Evelyn how to feel the soil, how to read the sky, how to wait with patience for green shoots to pierce the brown. His people's ways were steady, rooted in earth and season. Evelyn, in turn, taught him the patience of domestic rituals, how to mend cloth, how to twist braids smooth with steady hands. One morning, as she sat by the hearth weaving her hair, she noticed the braid did not tremble the way it once had. Her fingers, once unsteady from grief and loneliness, moved with calm assurance. She caught Thomas watching her as he often did. Instead of looking away, she met his gaze, and for the first time in years she smiled without bitterness. Spring spread across the land, cautious at first, then bold. Grass swayed in the wind, the air carried the scent of thawed earth, and the sound of life returned to the plains. The cabin that had once echoed with silence now hummed with quiet partnership. Months later they rode into town together, Evelyn upon her mare, Thomas astride a horse he had gentled himself. Their presence drew stares, some hostile, some uncertain, yet they did not ride as widow and fugitive. They rode as two souls bound by survival, dignity, and a love that no scar could erase. At the general store, where once even her coin had been accepted reluctantly, Evelyn walked in with Thomas at her side. Whispers rose, as whispers always would, but this time she did not bow her head. She spoke her needs clearly, her voice calm, steady. Thomas carried the parcels out with her, his scar visible in the afternoon light. The preacher, old and bent, but watchful, tipped his hat in quiet acknowledgement as they passed. That simple gesture was more than approval. It was recognition. On the ride home, the sun sank low, painting the sky with a fire of gold and rose. Evelyn leaned slightly toward Thomas, her shawl trailing in the wind. He glanced at her, his expression softened, and reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. They did not need words. The world had branded them, broken them, cast them aside. Yet here they were, riding home not in defeat but in quiet triumph. Their reckoning had not been written in blood or vengeance, but in the stubborn endurance of love and dignity. When the cabin came into view, smoke rising gently from its chimney, Evelyn exhaled as though releasing years of sorrow. Thomas squeezed, her hand once before letting go, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Home. Not hers alone, not his alone. Theirs. And in that truth, there was no shame, no brand, no scar deep enough to sever what they had become together. Snow still covered the land like a burial shroud, but the soldiers' search had not ceased. They moved through the settlement like wolves, sniffing, circling, their suspicion sharpened by hunger for order. It was inevitable, perhaps, that the trail would lead them to Evelyn's door. One afternoon, as she split kindling by the fence, she noticed a set of tracks pressed into the snow's crust. Not her own, not the deer that sometimes nosed near her garden. These were heavier, wider, the imprint of Thomas's boots. They curved from the woodpile toward the barn, a careless slip born of fatigue. Panic gripped her chest. She smoothed the tracks with her skirt, but already a faint echo of hoofbeats drifted from beyond the ridge. Minutes later, 2 soldiers appeared. Their coats were stiff with frost, their eyes colder still. One swung down from his horse, his boots crunching. As he advanced, "You live alone here, Mrs. Carter," he said. His voice was measured, but beneath it lay accusation. "Anyone passed through recently? Any stranger seeking shelter?" Evelyn steadied her breath. "Only the storm has visited," she answered. The man's gaze swept her cabin, the barn, the scattered wood. His eyes narrowed. "Funny thing," he muttered. "We found tracks heading this way. Not yours, ma'am. Bigger, heavier." The second soldier leaned from the saddle, rifle resting, casual but ready. "Best not to lie," he said. "Aiding an enemy's a hanging crime." Evelyn's mouth went dry. She clasped her shawl tighter. "There's no one here," she whispered. The first soldier stepped closer, close enough she could see the frost gathered in his beard. "If you're hiding him, you'll pay the price, you understand?" Her throat burned, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I understand," she said. At last, with a look half skeptical, half satisfied, the men mounted again. Their horses churned the snow and vanished into the pale horizon. Evelyn stood rooted long after they were gone, her breath ragged in the cold air. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. Thomas stepped into the threshold, his face shadowed with guilt. "That was too close," he murmured. "I shouldn't stay. If I do, they'll destroy you." She turned, snow still clinging to her skirt. "And if you go, they'll destroy you." His eyes wavered. He reached for his satchel as though already preparing. "Better me than you." "No," she said, her voice breaking into a whisper. She stepped forward and caught his hand, holding it tight as if to anchor him in place. "No more running." For a long moment, silence filled the cabin, broken only by the hiss of logs collapsing in the fire. Thomas lowered his gaze. His other hand rose, trembling, to the cloth he always kept bound across his chest. "I need you to see." he said, voice raw. So you'll understand. Slowly, he pulled back the fabric. Beneath it, the mark revealed itself. A scar seared, deep into his flesh. A brand pressed by soldier's iron. The cruel emblem of captivity, its edges jagged and red, carved into his very skin. His hand shook as he bared it, shame and fury woven into the tremor. Evelyn's breath caught. Her fingers, still locked with his, tightened. Tears welled in her eyes, but not of pity, of recognition. They marked you, she whispered. The way life marked me. She thought of her wedding dress folded in the chest, of the watch her husband had carried before death claimed him, of the neighbors who turned their faces when she passed. Widow, cursed, unwanted. They had branded her too, though no iron, had touched her skin. Her tears fell onto his scar one by one. He did not flinch. In the flicker of firelight, their bond shifted. It was no longer survival, no longer secrecy. It was defiance, fierce and solemn. She lifted his hand to her cheek, pressed it there as though swearing an oath. When their lips met, it was not with hunger or haste, but with the weight of two souls who knew tomorrow might be their last. The kiss was tender, yet unyielding, forged in the same fire that had seared them both. It carried dignity, not desperation, the quiet strength of those who refused to bow. That night, neither slept. They sat side by side before the fire, his scar bared, her shawl slipping loose from her shoulders. Words were few, yet the silence between them no longer frightened. It held them, like a vow. Morning brought no mercy. The soldiers returned, this time in greater number. Evelyn heard the thunder of hooves before she saw them crest the ridge. Their shouts cut the still air, commanding, insistent. Thomas rose, his face carved with resolve. He reached for the rifle propped against the wall. Her late husband's. Weapon, long untouched. The weight of it in his hands seemed both foreign and inevitable. You don't have to, she said. Though her voice carried no conviction, his gaze found hers. I will not let them take you for my crime. Something steadied in her then. She moved to the chest, lifted her husband's second rifle, the one he had cleaned so often that the wood still gleamed beneath dust. She stood beside Thomas, her braid falling against her back, her shawl sliding from her shoulders like a shroud cast off. Together, they faced the door as the riders approached. The fire within the hearth roared, its glow flaring against the cabin walls. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt alive, not in spite of her fear, but because of it. Love, she realized, was not a privilege of the young, nor a foolish dream for those untouched by grief. Love was survival's fiercest reward, the fire that allowed two broken souls to stand unbroken, and if that fire consumed them, so be it.